So I'm going to talk about the Persian Empire and its faith. I've got 15 minutes to talk about this enormous subject, so I'm going to go through it at some pace. But the two things I want you to think about as I go through this, this summation is time and space. I want you to think about the length of time in which Persian dynasties, Iranian dynasties, basically governed vast areas of the Middle East, and also the extent of that dominion. So we tend to talk about the Persian Empire in terms of the Achaemenid Persian Empire from the 6th century BC to around the 4th century BC. But actually, Persian empires in one form or another governed a huge expanse of the Middle East from, again, that 6th century BC through to about the 7th century AD. So we're talking about a millennium. And any dominion that lasts for a millennium over such a vast territory is going to have an impact. Sadly, in most Western understanding and histories of the period, the Persians only appear to get beaten by the Greeks. And this is really a bit of a marginalization of the story. And what we really need to understand is what the wider impact of that was. And I think the Persians, again, had a profound influence on the development of ideas and the development of religious ideas in particular. And a lot of this is sort of in the background. It basically provides the canvas, if you will, for the other sort of Abrahamic religions that come up afterwards. And this is really shaped by Zoroastrianism, okay? And Zoroastrianism is the faith that I'm really going to look at. Now, the way I have to look at it is a little bit more, how should we say, I mean, I'm going to, while I'm defining it in a sense as Zoroastrianism, we're talking about a collection of ideas that come together, we think, really in the early part of the first millennium. Take shape under the Achaemenids, and it's the Achaemenid Empire that has the largest dominion. It's the one that you're probably much, much more familiar with, the one that goes from the Thrace all the way to the Hindu Kush, from the Oxus down to Egypt and actually across to Libya. The later empires, the Parthian Empire and the Sasanian Empire, are much more constrained, if you will, but they're still sizable. I mean, we're talking about territories that go across, Hugh will forgive me when I talk about the Euphrates, the Oxus, the Indus, and the Caucasus. I mean, we're talking about large, large expanses of territory with a wider hinterland on which they have influence. And of course, the Persians, having had memories of larger dominions, by the way, never sort of forgot that actually Egypt does belong to them. So it's that sort of thing where they wanted to sort of be able to say that they have claims over wider territories. And of course, in terms of religious ideas, they had, some of you will notice that I've missed out the Seleucids, but you know, that Greek interlude is an interlude, and we're not get too het up about it. Clearly, the Hellenization did have some impact, but not the sort of impact you might think on the sort of religious ideas. So Zoroaster as a figure, as an individual, as a prophet, when do we think he lived? Some people have argued he's sort of early 6th century BC, but actually most people now accept he's probably a lot of this is quite vague, around sort of 1100 or 1200 BC is when he may or may not have operated. Again, these things are sort of debatable. They're contested. I don't want to get into too much detail about, you know, what the veracity of this is, but clearly it has an impact. And the impact, I think, in my view, you can see with the rise of the Achaemenid Empire. Now, again, if you go back to the idea of space as well and the vastness of the Achaemenid Empire, it can only be governed in a different way to the earlier empires. And you see this very vividly on the friezes in Persepolis. For those of you who have the fortune, unfortunately I can't go anymore, but if you ever get the fortune of going to Persepolis, one of the things that you find quite striking about Persepolis is the friezes are all very ceremonial. They're about basically the celebration of the new year and gift bearing for the king. People are holding hands, they're following in chains. These are not scenes of warfare. They're not scenes of bloodshed. There is one particular scene of bloodshed, which is the king killing the lie. Okay, the beast, if you will. And this highlights one of the key elements of, I think, Achaemenid kingship, and then, of course, what goes down into the whole Persian ideas of kingship. And that is the introduction of a concept of morality. Okay, so the division of the world into good and evil. Naturally, the king is always on the side of good, so let's not get too het up about that. It's clearly a governing ethos. But the fact is what he does, what the Achaemenids do is they borrow from an idea which I think basically it has its echoes in this sort of Zoroastrian inheritance, this Zoroastrian worldview, which is that the world is divided between good and evil, and the king represents basically that link to the wise lord, the good lord, who is seeking to basically contend with a wicked or an evil lord for the dominion of the earth. Now, what does Zoroastrianism in that sense introduce us to in terms of that kingship? It's a principle of duality. Okay, and the duality is important. Now, modern Zoroastrians will tell us that Zoroastrianism is basically as monotheistic as any other religion. There are obviously monotheistic elements to it, and I want to sort of highlight what that is. And that is that ultimately good will triumph over evil. But the fact is that the way in which they understand the creation is a dual creation. That is, there is a wise lord, Ahura Mazda, and you see this in the edicts of Darius the Great and others, who is the creator of all that is good. And then the wicked Lord Ahriman is the creator of all that is evil. And for every good creation, you get a wicked creation. And these two aspects are in competition with each other within time. And ultimately, man, or mankind, is a good creation, is part of the good creation, and mankind acts as an agent in that contest for the wise Lord, for good. So you have agency. Now, these are a number of distinctive elements that Zoroastrianism, I think, brings into the sort of ethos. It's not necessarily just simply the context of the concept of linear time. I think the Mesopotamians, others would have produced this notion of a sort of a linear construction of time. What the Zoroastrian ethos or worldview brings with it is the concept of the end of times. And if you get to the end of times, you begin to sort of understand that there is an end state in which we have to work towards. And therefore that contest between good and evil is that contest to achieve the triumph of good at the end of the day. Now you can begin to see how this feeds in. I'll go into a little bit more detail when I get to my 5-minute mark about some of the key themes, because I think that there are key themes that we will see, as Ian is going to ask me, obviously, about the legacy of that onto other religions. But hopefully you can begin to see some of the parameters of that notion, that when you have man as an agent, it's not that mankind is a plaything of the gods. Mankind is a product of a creation of the good, the wise Lord, and is there as an agent to basically promote the triumph of good over evil. And that has a lot of implications to it. It means that you're all active agents in this project, and you all have to make your choices. Now, the Zoroastrianism that we understand today, as we have understood, has come down to us really as a product of the later Persian empires, as it becomes codified and as it becomes as it becomes more detailed in a sense and more refined, both under the Parthian Empire and obviously the Sasanian Empire, which is really the key moment when Zoroastrianism takes shape. It becomes a little bit more exclusive, it has to be said, it becomes a little bit more constrained, but nonetheless it has a tremendous impact in terms of being the dominant religion and the state religion of the Sasanian Empire. And it is there that it contends obviously with the Romans as a Christian empire. Eventually in Byzantium, obviously that's one of the great clashes of religious faith. Although I should say that one of the aspects of Zoroastrianism that we find, or one of the aspects of the Sasanian Empire that we find, is also the dramatic increase in Christianity that also develops in Iran. And this, as I will sort of try and emphasize, is part of the, my eyesight is not so bad, is part of the reflection of the fact that there are certain echoes, shall we say, certain reflections between Zoroastrianism and Christianity that we'll see that drew people together. Now, there are two other figures that I want to draw on just to show that Zoroastrianism does have sort of elements of diversity, shall we say, in religious thought that have come through. One of them, which other people know about, is Mazdakism. Mazdakism is a sort of a proto-communist, as some people try to call it, type of religious faith in which a religious leader comes up and protests that everything belongs to everyone, including wives, which is not a great idea. You can see that fell out of favour fairly quickly. But it was an interesting insurrectionary movement. But the other one that you'll be more familiar with is Manichaeism and the prophet Mani. And the prophet Mani is basically someone who comes together. And again, it shows one of the great driving forces of religious ideas in the Iranian plateau and the Iranian world is its cosmopolitanism. The prophet Mani declares himself in a way almost like a disciple of Christ, actually. I mean, this is a 3rd century AD phenomenon. He wants to marry together Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. So it's a great combination. And some of his ideas then have a longer term impact in the medieval West, slightly different to what he originally was talking about. This idea, again, the duality about the spiritual good and the material that is wicked. But these are ideas. I just want to throw these out in a very summary way to you, just to show that there are diversities of ideas that come out and have different sort of impacts upon the West and the development of religion in the West, particularly in Christianity. Mithraism is another is another sort of subset. Not the same, as I'm sure I will be told and re-emphasised, as Roman Mithraism, which is quite different, although we like to claim it because there's a wonderful Mithraic temple in Hadrian's Wall. So I like to think the Persians got up to Scotland, Ian. But sadly, it's not the same Mithraism, although they claimed it was a Persian cult and this sort of thing. Actually has very little to do with Persian Mithraism. But Mithraism also has this sort of element of a son of the gods who has a birthday at a particular time of year, and it's all about oath-making and sort of promises. I mean, it's that sort of, there's enough echoes. I don't want to really go further than that. But nonetheless, it's there. So because of the size, you know, what I always say, because of the size of the Persian empires, how do you govern these empires? You can govern these empires. Governing these empires by force is not really a practical possibility. So you have to govern them by ideas, the force of ideas, if I can put it that way. And this is why, actually, you know, one of the interesting things about Zoroastrianism, what is the catalyst? Does Zoroastrianism come first, or the ideas, and then you get the imperial dominion? Or does the imperial dominion suggest that you have to have different ways of governing? And, you know, if you look at the way in which the Greeks looked at the ancient Persian kings and others, they all do comment on this, that the Persian kings have a way of persuading people to basically acknowledge their hegemony and dominion. How do they do that? I think it's through these religious ideas. The notion of morality, the notion of the truth and the lie, the notion of good and evil, this idea that the king represents that which is good and stable in a spiritual link, and is able to persuade the others that he must accept that dominion. It cannot be done by sheer brute force alone. Clearly, force does have a role. Any imperial dominion does. But the size of these dominions requires people to actually believe in what they're doing. It requires them to acknowledge it. And I think that's an interesting imperial idea, of course, which may have been echoed by other empires down the ages. So what are the key themes that really come out of this, which I think are very important? One, as I've said, is that morality, the notion of good and evil, which obviously Nietzsche and others picked up on in the 19th century. By the way, I should say Zoroastrianism became very popular among Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century, some of it quite made up, but nonetheless, it was something that they really picked up on. Man as an agent of good, mankind as an agent of the fight between good and evil. Linear history, but more particularly the end of times. The end of times punctuated by eras which are led by spiritual redeemers. Think about it, okay? Spiritual redeemers. The Saoshyant that comes in as, in some cases, born of a virgin birth. Come in and inaugurate new eras. If you go to Iran today, they'll tell you an era is 3,000 years or an era is 12,000 years. Depends on whether you think the Islamic Republic is coming to an end or not. So if you think of the 3,000 years, we're on to a winner fairly soon. However, if it's 12,000 years, that's going to leave us a little bit longer. It all depends on it depends on where you think Zoroaster lived. By the way, that's the way the dating is operated. The king has divine grace, but the king, unlike the Hellenic model, is not divine. The king operates as that sort of spiritual gateway to the divine, and if he does good, he reinforces his divine grace. If he is hubristic or bad or evil, he loses divine grace. It's an important sort of element of the idea of good governance, by the way. Do good, and good will be done to you. It's a great idea, right? The idea of justice is very important in the circle of justice. So I think there are vast echoes of this within the broader canvas of Middle Eastern religions. I think it's vitally important, really, we understand it and see it. As I said, any imperial dominion that lasts for 1,000 years has an impact, and it has echoes. And we ought to acknowledge it and see how that feeds into both, particularly Christianity and obviously Islam. As we'll be told, no doubt, when the Arabs come in the 7th century, they absorbed the Sasanian Empire in its entirety. And that absorption brings with it certain consequences. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Ian. Now I can see.
Absolutely fascinating. Why do you think the impact, you said earlier in your speech, why is the impact of ancient Persian culture on Western civilization, why is it underestimated generally? Not by you, generally.
I'll tell you why. I think it's modern politics, to be honest. I mean, if 1979 hadn't happened, I think we would probably have a lot more attention being paid to the contribution of the Persians and wider Iranian civilization to global civilization. But since 1979, I think it's taken a bit of a hit. And, I think that was it. I mean, if you go back to the 18th century, 19th century, and certainly the early part of the 20th century, there was a good body of work being done in the West on the contribution of not only the Pope, but also Zoroastrianism. And some of the most senior scholars actually working on Zoroastrianism were based in the West. I mean, this is what they were doing. So I think since 79, we've certainly lost sight of it. I think the reasons are fairly obvious. What's fascinating for me is just how much it's being taken up in Iran itself at the moment, partly as sort of a dissident opinion. If you want to be a real dissident in Iran, you have to proclaim yourself sort of like a follower of Ahura Mazda. That really I was going to say it really annoys people. Let me put that one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.